This week on Two Legs, it's Robert Rodriguez, and we talk about cold cuts. He also gives us information about his show, Something About The Beatles. We talk a little bit about the books he's written, and we had a really good time talking about what we could or what we would like to see for the Get Back, Let It Be reissue.
And also, here on Two Legs, we'll be doing our first ever giveaway. Our co-host here, Tom, is going to give away 3 books. So stay tuned at the end of the show and hear how you could win those too.
Stay tuned. Hi, McCartney fans, and welcome to another edition of Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast. We are a Paul McCartney talk show mainly dealing with the solo career of Paul McCartney. My name is Tom Hunyadi, and you may know me from my other show, Talk More Talk, where me and my 3 co-hosts just sort of rabble on about all things solo Beatles. And with me, as always, is my partner in crime, one Andy Nichols. Andy, how you doing, my friend?
I'm hanging in there. I'm battling the flu, but I'm here and happy to talk some cold cuts.
Awesome. Well, you look well, actually. You don't look sick at all, but you look, like you slept for 12 hours, so.
I did. I wasn't sure. I wanted to get this one in, and it's a great topic, and happy to be here today and discuss, our favorite guy and his cold cuts.
Yes, cool. Well, before we get started, I got this little thing, people that listen to the show, they all know that I started with the show with my cousin, David, and from time to time, he just likes to send me crap that he doesn't want anymore. Well, I really shouldn't say crap, but stuff that he doesn't want. And we're going to do this thing where it's called, instead of sing-along junk, I'm going to call it giveaway junk. And like I said, it's not really junk, but it just fit. But what we're going to do is after the show, we do have a special guest today. And after the interview, I should say, we're going to set up a contest where you could win 3 books here. One is The True Story of the Beatles. These are all just small paperback edition. So, Story of the Beatles, we've got, in his own right in the Spanish in the works, and then we also got the Longest Cocktail here. So, these 3 books, if anybody wants them, will be available after the show, and I'll...
and they all look like first edition, which is cool.
Yeah, they all look old, and a couple of them do say first edition, so, I should say David said a few of these were first edition, so, I really don't have any interest in, I might read The Longest Cocktail, but...
That's worth it alone because of when it was written. It was written very early there, and this thing was published in 72 or 73, so for that time period, it was a very good read by Richard, I believe Delisle was his name.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Also, I do have one thing I want to show. I know a lot of people are friends with him on Facebook and on Instagram. His name is Rick Young. He's an artist. And he did a really wonderful piece here. This is Paul McCartney via 1968. He does great work. I just wanted to give him a shout out. Check out his Facebook page. He just doesn't do Beatles stuff. He does anything. I mean, he just did a really nice Neil Peart sketch after he passed on, and he actually did a whole Rush portrait of all 3 of them that was really nice. And so I say just go ahead and check out his Facebook page and check out his art, and if you like it, support the guy because he does really, really cool work.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that being said, like I said earlier, we do have a very special guest. This guy is very busy. We're very honored to have him with us today, and he really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyways, because he just deserves it. One of the books here is Revolver how the Beatles reimagined rock and roll. Another one here, 70 or solo in the 70s. And another one, we got the Fab Four FAQ, which he co-wrote with Stuart Shea, right there. And then the one he did by himself, Fab Four FAQ 2.0, the solo years 70 to 80. He is also the host of a very popular podcast called Something About The Beatles. It's a wonderful show, a lot of great information every time I listen to it, and really pleased to welcome Robert Rodriguez to the show. Robert, hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hey guys, it is my pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, just out of the blue, I mean, one who listens to your show can tell that you do a lot of bootlegs on your show, and that got me thinking, oh, if he's such a big bootleg fan, maybe he'll join us for this topic. Because I remember I reached out to you, I think it was in 2017, to come on and do this show with us, but then two other Paul McCartney podcasts, put out a cold cut show, so I was like, maybe we'll just, leave it for another time, and we really appreciate you, stepping up and joining us for this. But let's just talk about you for a minute. For people that aren't familiar with you, which I hope everybody that's listening today, I hope they are familiar with you, but talk about you, Robert Rodriguez, as the Beatle fan, how that happened, and when did you start collecting Beatles music?
I started collecting pretty much in my early teens, and this was at some point in the 70s when pretty much once I recognized that I had the American catalog, and that was a very useful thing when people were Christmas shopping or birthday shopping for, well, these are the gaps in my collection. I need this and this and this. And so that was a no-brainer thing. But it turned into something where that wasn't enough for me, and I'd be reading a book like All Together Now, which was probably one of the first three Beatle books I ever read by Wally and Harry. And that, the sections in there on live recordings and BBC and stuff like that, the Beatles scholarship was in its infancy then. And this is, the mid to late 70s. So it was really hard to come by this stuff. And it certainly wasn't digital. And I tended to figure out, if there's a way to track this stuff down, I'm going to have to go to Beatle conventions, which were just starting up then. Look at the ads in the back of Rolling Stone, and that was a gold mine, because suddenly I was getting catalogs in the mail from places out on the West Coast that were offering all kinds of amazing stuff. I'm sure you're familiar with the stuff that was on, Amazing Cornyphone and all those great bootleg labels. And so because there was so little information, a lot of times you'd be getting these bootlegs and you have to rely on the liner notes to what you were getting, which most of the time were completely false. They, pulling stuff out of the air, and things like "Have you heard the word?" which we know has nothing whatsoever to do with the Beatles, but you're like, hey, this is great, an undiscovered, unreleased Beatles song, cool. You get all excited about that stuff. And I was thinking today, going into this show, because we are talking about Paul McCartney's Cold Cuts, that great unfulfilled project of his, that there was a bootleg I picked up at some point in the 70s called Wings on the Radio. Are you familiar with that?
No,
it's not what you would think. It's not like Wings BBC broadcast or something like that. What it was a really cool, unique concept, which was somebody scooping up all this non-album B-side stuff, which, of course, during the 70s, McCartney's quite prolific. Some of his B-sides, some of his A-sides, like Hi, 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 See Moon, and I Lie Around, Country Dreamer, things like that. And they put together an album, side one, side two, where it was the illusion of hearing these songs on the radio interspersed with, somebody turning a dial on the radio or excerpts from TV shows of the day, which is really cool. So it stands as its own little concept, and boy, that's something I wish somebody would digitize and put out there, because I'd love to revisit that. It was such a cool idea.
That's a cool concept, yeah.
Yeah, I think it only came up to 75. There was nothing past that in terms of McCartney material, but for that window, say 72 through 74, it was pretty cool.
Oh yeah, very true. Now, while you're getting into the Beatles, were you also getting into the solo stuff as well at the same time?
More or less, yeah. Venus and Mars was the first Wings album I bought, first McCartney solo album I bought when it was new, as a kid with very limited income at the time. So it's you have to be very selective in what you're spending your money on. And so it was, besides being a very enjoyable album, it came with all the goodies, the posters and the stickers and stuff. You're thinking, man, this is great value. And there was a heyday in the 70s where you get posters and sometimes booklets and things like that with the packaging. I mean, you think about it now, buying Quadrophenia with that great book of Ethan Russell photography. It's like, geez, spend a ton of money on something like that now. So, spoiled. We didn't know it.
Right, that's very true. Very true. So, growing up, when did you decide that the Beatles was something you wanted to, the Beatles or the solo Beatles was something you wanted to write about? I mean, were you not seeing the information that you wanted to see? Were you learning for more information? And, I mean, is that one of the deciding factors of you becoming a writer?
I would say that when the Beatle literary canon was so sparse when I became a fan. You'd shown a little bit ago Longest Cocktail Party. That was probably in my first 5 books that I read on the Beatles because it was around, as of 72. And but there wasn't not a lot of information. So by the time I actually got to fulfill my ambition to become a writer, you're talking early 2000s. And of course, by that time, there's tons, almost too many. And what then became the challenge was not that there wasn't enough information, but that what information was out there, you kind of knew was not very well curated. There was stuff that even then we kind of knew, well, this is kind of mythology, and the books are just repeating themselves. And there are people out there who were there that know for certain. For instance, Alistair Taylor was not Raymond Jones, though he claimed that. And a lot of other things, like taken straight out of Lennon Remembers and amplified, were accepted as fact, and they absolutely were not. So it came to a point where I wanted to sort of raise the Beatles scholarship by doing some serious research, but also make it accessible. And I came up with that format, called the FAQ, which was not literally questions with answers, but I wanted to denote, if you're looking for answers, in this case about the Beatles, this book will have them. And the real beauty of it was deconstructing their story chapter by chapter. This one's on live gigs. This one's on Beatle photography. This one's on recordings that only had 1 or 2 Beatles on them, guest appearances, Beatle film, all that sort of thing. So the book invited you to come into it at any point of interest and then see where it took you. You didn't have to read it start to finish. You could just dive in at your area of interest. So that was my goal with the FAQs, and next thing you know, that became a full-blown series. But I tell people that I wrote the first book so that I could write the second book.
Very good.
The second book being my era of fandom in the 70s. It's like I really thought that was underserved in the Beatles' literary canon, where you've got the 4 solo careers going on, as well as this giant shadow of their collective past. It's like, Bannon runs Great Paul, but when are the Beatles getting back together? That's really kind of a struggle to sort of establish yourself as an artist when all people want to talk about is what you did when you're 25 years old.
Right. You mentioned the FAQ, and that's really expanded. I mean, tenfold. I mean, I have the Neil Young FAQ, I have the Kiss FAQ. Thanks to Kid O'Toole, I have the Michael Jackson FAQ. I think I have a Doctor Who one as well. Could we realistically maybe see a complete FAQ on Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, John Lennon, and George? Because obviously, you just wrote about the first 10 years. I mean, could those series continue in the future, possibly?
Oh, absolutely. There's all kinds of rich material there, and I'd always had it in the back of my head. Well, wouldn't a Fab 4 FAQ 3.0 be great, 1980 to 2001? Because then you've got another well-demarcated era that would encompass Anthology, the Wilburys, the All-Star Tours, Paul's resurgence from '89, touring and going on the road, and all these great releases, and through George's lifetime. So it would be another well-defined era. The trouble is, a day is 24 hours, a year is 65 days, and I would invite anybody who wants to be the writer to do that. I'll help you with it. I just haven't got the hours in the day put into it right now with everything else I got going on. But boy, I'd sure love to read that book.
Right. Well, I didn't necessarily mean you per se writing it. I mean, like you said, I mean, you would welcome anybody to write it, but I just look at it as, I mean, here you have, McCartney, who has this, 50, year career, and, I would just love to see that FAQ book on his full career rather than just the first 10. But,
Yeah.
like you said, I mean, there's only so many hours in the day.
Right, but I'm with you. I think that the field is wide open for somebody authoritative to come along and do the actual legwork. Now, we had a little bit of discussion earlier about 8 Arms to Hold You. Chip Mattinger and Mitch, I would say Mitch Easter is not his name. What is it? Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Mark Easter. Mark Easter.
Yeah, it's Mark. Okay. Anyway, that book is fabulous, and I cannot recommend it enough. Going through all the solo recordings from day one up until 2000, and it'd be wonderful for somebody to pick up the torch and carry that forward. But just as a resource, it's so unbelievably well researched. Where they're sitting there listening to audio tapes of concerts that eventually were released to the public and comparing. Well, these overdubs were done, or no, this was actually what you hear in the live album is pretty much as it was performed. Which is the story of Wings Over America, which everybody believed this myth that it was basically re-recorded in the studio. It wasn't. It's garbage. So thank God for these guys doing that stuff. So there's so many rabbit holes to go down to in Beatles and solo Beatles research. I'm grateful for the fact that we live in a time where, with what is accessible to us, it's easier to get to do some solid research in a way that it wasn't, say, 20, 30 years ago.
Right. You mentioned the research. Excuse me. Volume 3 of a great series that I've been loving. I'm still waiting for my copy. Hopefully, I'll get it this coming week. But don't know if you were able to order the Volume 3 of A is for Apple, which has just been another Trevor Trove of information. I think. I mean, what are your thoughts on that series? Are you a fan?
Oh, yeah, I love those guys, Axel and the guys that work with him on that. I had him on the show, actually, my show a couple years ago. That was, I think, before Volume 2 had come out, and now Volume 3 is just dropping. And, thank God for guys like this that are collating all this information. He's coming up with people like Trevor Bannister, people like that were around Apple. There's so much of Apple that we think we know. And through these guys, we're finding out there's a lot more depth to it. Just the bands that they signed for their publishing that they might not have even expected to release and promote. So that's another rich area for scholarship, and I'm grateful to those guys because, if you specialize in one area, it's seemingly the path will open to you, and people will start giving you stuff like, okay, I know you guys are serious, and you're going to write the book, and you're going to do it right, so here's what I got. And, before that generation dies off completely, they're chronicling it. So I'm very grateful for that stuff.
Yeah, it's an amazing series. I mean, at first they thought it was going to be a 3-volume series, and as we know now, with Volume 3 only covering midway of '69, I'm sure we can expect at least 3 more books probably after this, if they are covering up until 1975, which I believe would be the end of, or '76 would be the end of Apple. So
yeah, I would love for them just to do some exploring of the different artists that work at Apple Studios. That's like a whole area unto itself that I think most people aren't aware of.
Right. Let's get to Something About the Beatles, because I'm glad. I mean, obviously we know what the show was. I'm glad that it's continuing. I think it's a very important podcast out there, just because of the wealth of the information that you bring to the table for everybody to hear. How's the show going? I noticed that you got a lot of guest hosts in with you now these days. Is this something you plan on continuing to do? What does the future hold for Something About the Beatles?
So it's the kind of thing where it was always about a conversation. And I've only ever done one show that was only me. And that was basically, and you were in Monmouth, so you remember when I did that opening thing on the Easter demos, and so I made that show because I recorded it. But it's always been having, a give or take with me and somebody else. Sometimes it's just a straight-up interview with me and one guest. Sometimes it'll be a couple people, and we'll be talking to a guest. Like when I have Jerry Hammock on, his series is wonderful. I like to have somebody else with a recording background on there because I'm not a techno head as far as that stuff goes. But I know plenty of people who are, and that love his books. So there'll be another interview with Jerry coming up with another guy that's got that background. So I always like it when I have practitioners on the show. for instance, like if I'm talking about, Ringo as a drummer. Now, I recently had Alex Kane and Terry McCusker on because they wrote those wonderful books on Ringo's drumming. But there's other people, and I have one in the can now, with a musician, multi-instrumentalist, producer, engineer, Luther Russell, who was on the show with Jody Stevens previously from Big Star.
Okay.
And he was chomping at the bit to do a show just on Ringo about technique, because he was the guy who started out as a drummer before he became, into guitar and bass and other stuff. But he had some real insights into Ringo as a drummer that, I find it amazing to this day that people still walk around and repeat that joke about John Lennon saying not even the best drummer of the Beatles, which he never, of course, said. But there's still too many people believe in that nonsense. Even though now he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he got all his accolades from Stuart Copeland and all these other great drummers. It's like, and that's just one thing. So if
those are the people that still believe it was just Yoko Ono that broke up the Beatles.
Exactly. They have no idea of the nuance and complexities of their story. So, if you believe in the cartoon version of the Beatles, then you're being well served by other shows that are out there, or other literature, or Facebook groups, or whatever. But I see what you do and what I do as something a lot more nuanced and in-depth, and really based on following where the history takes us, and not just repeating nonsense that makes us feel good because it dovetails with our worldview.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think it is important to put in the work and to show that you do care about the facts, and because that's what it comes down to is really, it's just making sure you get your facts correct and being, accepting it. It's not always easy to, I guess I can say it is easy to just come on a show like this and just spew anything else you want, and then have people think that you're correct when you're not, but you really do have to put this work in it. You do. Your latest show on 1973, the year I was born, I'm really looking forward to listening to that one, because I thought that was not only a great year for the solo Beatles and the Beatles themselves, but it's just a great year in music. How was that episode for you with your guest Andrew Grant?
Oh, it's a great show. It was one that I really look forward to, because the guy is such a great writer, and it's rare when I'll pick up something new and think, God, I wish I'd written this book, because he really pulls together a context for the year, not just what's going on in music, but what was going on in the world, like the energy crisis that impacted, because petroleum goes into making of vinyl, how that affected what decisions record companies made as to what artists they were going to promote and put money into and which ones they weren't. So the fact that you can tie all that stuff together and really make sense of what got attention that year and what was sort of bubbling under, but then became a force in the years to come, that to me is fascinating, to see how these currents all affected each other. The Beatles by that time, the ex-Beatles, I feel, were sort of in their own universe. They'd established themselves as individual artists, and if you accept their world, that what albums they put out as not necessarily meaning to be competing with Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or something like that, then they're perfectly enjoyable, fine work. It's if you don't come with that sort of tacit understanding that you're like, okay, what should I spend my money on in 1973? This Dark Side of the Moon or Red Rose Speedway? That's when your values come into it. It's like, well, unless you're already a Paul McCartney fan, you might be giving them equal weight and not really, sure which is the way to go. But, if you already enjoy them for the work they did in the past and who they are as artists, then, they're always, I think, pretty much going to satisfy you.
Right. Well, you mentioned Dark Side of the Moon, and one bit of information that I've never been able to find all the correct information about was, and I know, but I was hoping maybe you could help out with it, is, during the recording of Dark Side of the Moon, they did, in fact, record all the members of Wings to be on that album, correct?
I know about Paul and Linda, and I know about Henry McCullough. I don't know about Denny Seiwell.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my only, to contribute. I wish I knew more. And in fact, I think in 8 Arms to Hold You, they get a little bit into at least what they know to exist. Henry made the cut, Paul and Linda didn't.
Right.
Right. That was always something I wanted to talk to Alan Parsons about, because he was the engineer on that album, I believe, correct?
Yes, and then Chris Thomas did the remix.
Right. Gotcha.
Just hitting back on a point that Robert had made about the point of getting all the the facts straight. We're reaching a very interesting time now. A lot of the principal players are approaching that age where they're going to start dying off, and we've lost a lot of people. So it's important to really kind of get all this stuff down now accurately, because this, as time marches on, what the work that you've done, the work that Alan Coe, everybody has done is going to be, that's what's going to be left. So the principal players are going to be gone, and all we have is what the work that yourself and others have done. So that's really is going to be the legacy, and what we're going to look back on to see what was fact and what was not. I mean, just in case in point, Robert, I lived in Liverpool for 2 years, and I got to know Joe Flannery quite well. I don't know if you know Joe, but
yes.
I got to know Joe quite a bit in grad school, and he was a great guy. And he passed away a couple of years ago. And I didn't even know who Joe Flannery was until I got to Liverpool. So, I mean, that's just one example of, as time marches on, getting the record straight with the people involved in this entire story,
It's funny you bring him up as an example, because I just interviewed Spencer Lee this week.
Ah, I know Spencer.
Yeah, Spencer's great. And he's a guy that does take the time and trouble to get the stories right. And we talked a bit about that process of interviewing people. And I've said on my show before that sometimes the worst witnesses were the people that were there. And it's not to be facetious, but it's because if you were a Beatle, let's say, you're busy doing your job and you're recording and laying the ground. You're not thinking about your legacy in that moment. You're not thinking about documenting, well, I used this bass on this track and this was what the mic we used. And that sort of stuff that drives us, we love that stuff. We'll eat that stuff right up. We want to know every goddamn detail.
Right.
But there are plenty of people out there in the Beatle world, and I think we know their names, and I'm not going to slander anybody here, but that because they were there, they feel that gives them an extra boost of credibility that is not their due. And it's people like Spencer Lee's that will say, well, wait a minute, I know for a fact that this is not, you're kind of inflating your role here. And there's people that I think we kind of know who they are. I can say now about Alistair Taylor, as I mentioned in previous case, because he's moved on, about claiming he was Raymond Jones. And there wasn't a Raymond Jones, when in fact there was a Raymond Jones who ordered that copy of My Bonnie and set everything in motion as far as the Brian Epstein story goes. So you have to take with a grain of salt. But I've done a few shows now with Erin Weber, who is the historian. She wrote The Beatles and the Historians. And she sort of codified what I'd already sort of kind of intuited when it comes to doing research and weighing the value of certain books and the credibility of interviewees and measuring what is the context of their talk, who are they talking to, what are they promoting, and who is the intended audience. Also, is there any contemporaneous, maybe not for public consumption, evidence to back up what they're saying here in the form of recordings of conversations that just happen to be taped, like the Niagara reels of the Beatles at Twickenham, or you just never know what surfaces. But you have to take all that into account and sort of separate it from whatever agenda that might be speaking through at that moment to really get a sense of, well, does this ring credible to me, or is this clearly a narrative driven because they're promoting a particular product or a particular place in the world, a sort of establishing a brand for themselves. John and Yoko, for all they're calling Paul the greatest PR man in the world, that was really a case of projection and transference. Paul was not talking to the press during a lot of the 70s, and they were the ones out there establishing themselves on any number of levels as the ones to tell what was what about the Beatles and the inside story. And a lot of stuff that we know is dead wrong factually. So that's why I'm really happy to see that the historiography these days is taking all this stuff a lot more seriously than it ever did before, looking at it more critically, which is not to burn everything to the ground, but being a lot more selective about, okay, is there support evidence for this? As the years go on, we in addition to the people that might have gone on record that you have to then sort of measure, are they speaking truthfully, or are they creating mythology? But what supporting evidence has just come out that we didn't have access to 20, 30 years ago, like the studio chatter and things like that?
Right. I've always felt, Robert, too, 1980, especially with Lennon's death, is a dividing line for a lot of the books, because if you look at the texts were just written so differently. You had mentioned All Together Now by Wally. Anything, or Nicholas Schaffner's The Beatles Forever. Any of those pre-1980 texts, I've always felt, while they might be not factually accurate, I think they're written in such a different tone, because Lennon was still alive, that you look at it differently, anything post-1980, I think.
Oh, sure, because that's when the mythology starts to kick in that promotes Lennon to something that he wasn't in life. And this is with all due respect to John Lennon. You can't immerse yourself in this world, put all the time and energy and hours into doing what we do without feeling personally connected to these people. So if I offer any criticism of these guys at all, it's coming out of not wishing to knock them off their pedestal, but wanting to get the truth out, because I think the truth is far more compelling anyway. But I am old enough to remember John being thought of during those 5 years before he reemerged in 1980 as an unserious clown. That, he was a guy that drop of a hat would take off his clothes in public, or he would, get drunk in clubs and assault waitresses, that sort of thing. And, some of that stuff gets embellished and inflated, but it also shows that the figure post-1980 that has been thrust upon us is definitely not the way he was known while he was alive. And so you have to, I think that that point, as certain players are shuffling off the stage in the next few years to come, I think you're going to see a lot more truth-telling coming out, maybe from some people that were there that kind of had to sit on their stories up until that point, but also stuff that becomes available. What'll be very curious to me is seeing where, for instance, once Yoko has transitioned on, where's Sean going to stand on this? Is he going to, say, now I can tell this and I couldn't when my mom was alive? That sort of thing. Are we going to be seeing more of that?
Interesting.
Same with Julian, too, perhaps.
Yeah, well, he's been kind of frank, off and on through the years himself. I think he's in a good place right now, but I can remember, when was it, in the 90s, when he put out that Photograph Smile album?
Yeah.
And he's going on Jay Leno. And, in fact, I have anecdotal stuff from a friend of mine who ran into him during that era that just completely dressed him up and down when the guy made the mistake of saying, "I'm a big fan of your father's." It's like, oops.
Whoops.
Right.
Yeah.
One last thing I want to talk to you about before we get to cold cuts. People that has listened to your show know that you've done the 2 episodes on that wonderful month in January of '69. We've got that Get Back, Let It Be reissue coming. What are your hopes for this set? What are you looking to see if hopefully they'll release? I mean, I would take it you probably got that 86 disc set of the Get Back sessions. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of the chatter, a lot of the songs. What are you looking forward to for this set?
Well, the funny thing so far is that there's been so much buzz since it was announced last year that Peter Jackson was taking this on, that there was sort of this reactionary response that, oh my God, here it comes. Paul McCartney's going to commission this guy to rewrite history. Right. And I see that so often. It's like, that is because you are buying into the myth that this was a 4.5 weeks of pure misery that the Beatles themselves pushed. To a man, every one of them described it as the worst point in their career. And it's pure nonsense. I don't know if Doug Sulpi's of the opinion that they got their concept of how it went down from watching the Let It Be film. And whatever else you can call the Let It Be film, with all due respect to Michael Lindsay Hogg, I don't think you can call it a documentary, since it doesn't document really what happened. Is there any indication that George quit during that session? No. John's heroin use? No. It's sort of a series of vignettes that I think was cobbled together to make it sort of have this tone where you're looking for the release that comes with first the Apple Studio jams and then the Let It Be rooftop thing, where all of a sudden it just comes to life. It gives you this great moment of release from all the tension to that point. I think that is what happens when, rather than the single vision of one directorial hand in charge, it was sort of cobbled together by committee, because he did do a director's cut, which was far longer. And then the Beatles saw that screening in July '69, and the next thing you know, he's being forced to cut bits and bits out of it to leave us with the product we have. So people have this perception, propagated by the Beatles themselves, that it was nothing but pure misery and them breaking up on camera and all this other crap. I would say to the people who have studied the tapes that what you really come away with is a sense of first couple of weeks, they're not happy to be at Twickenham, but they're also really sort of trying to wrap their heads around, well, what is the end game here? What are we doing? They still, by the time they start showing up and cameras are rolling, they still haven't figured out what the concert's going to be at the end, the payoff to this whole thing. And they're going back and forth and stuff like that. George quits, things come to a head, which is not to say the first 10 days were nothing but misery. They were incredibly productive, considering coming in cold with nothing in their hands. And then once you shift to Apple Studios for the last last 10 days or so, all of a sudden things are they're golden. Billy Preston's there. They're finally locked in as a band. They've got this wealth of material. They've got the entire follow-up album, Abbey Road, all but written, but 4 songs of it, which is amazing to think about. They walk away from these sessions with 3 number-1 hit singles. If that's a slog, if that's misery, every band should have that miserable a time. But I think so when Peter Jackson puts this together and presents much more the friendship and the work ethic and the productivity that these guys did under trying circumstances, it should be seen as rightfully restoring the narrative of the Let It Be project rather than the demythologizing that the Beatles themselves did, because they were breaking up by the time it came out, and so they put the worst light on it as possible. So hopefully people will look at this and go, oh, sure, Peter Jackson, just trying to, carrying the Beatles water and making them look so great when this is all, the Disney version. No, I mean, if he's doing his job, it's going to be more accurate, and it's going to show it as not being miserable.
And I think that myth was perpetuated a lot by a lot of what Lennon said too, in that Winter interview. I mean, a lot, people took what he said and ran with it. So they just kind of took that whole era, that whole Let It Be project, based on what Lennon said, in a very, very moment of kind of just where he was very kind of just negative on everything, and ran with it. Right. And just said, glossed it over, and the whole era, the whole album, the whole project was just doomed, and they were breaking up just based on what he said. So that's probably why, in my opinion, why a lot of that myth exists.
Yeah, and that these journalists or people, researchers that might not have had access to the tapes at the time, took it at face value and didn't challenge it. And then, there's no excuse for the last couple decades. Starting? I mean, we were getting vinyl bootlegs, Sweet Apple tracks, things like that in the 70s. But then the floodgates opened, at some point. So anybody walking around now that still believes and wants to put it out there that this was miserable and they were breaking up before the cameras and all that stuff, that's just pure garbage. It's not corroborated by the contemporaneous evidence.
No.
Gotcha. Cool. I appreciate that. So, reason why you're here, let's get into a little bit of cold cuts. Obviously, I mean, you are a bootleg guy, is that correct? Was that accurate to say?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I was not a guy who collected Beatle toys, that's for sure.
Right.
I was more interested in text, any books I can get my hands on, and magazines, as well as any recordings I can get my hands on. Right. And I have to say that it really got so much better come the digital age when you get this awful sounding dubs that were put on a bootleg vinyl that you dutifully bought because you wanted everything, and you didn't really necessarily know the context. But then come this digital age, you're getting much more clean, pristine stuff. Even if it is 30 takes of Long and Winding Road, at least you can judge with your own ears. What's going on here.
Right. When was the first time you were aware of this project of Cold Cuts as a bootleg?
I would say once again to circle back to All Together Now. I probably read about it in there. I think at some point I started picking up Beatle Fan magazine, probably in the late 70s. There was also Strawberry Fields Forever, and whatever other publications I can get my hands on. Certainly Wings Club Sandwich was around. I picked that up as I could find it. It was kind of pricey, but when I was a young fan, if I came across a copy, I'd pick it up just because I wanted the information. And so certainly talk of it in there.
Right. So, I mean, there's information in different areas about cold cuts, about the history of cold cuts, and hopefully we can, we're going to talk a little bit about it and see if we can, I'll see if this information is indeed, correct, or if you have a different idea of what may have happened, that'd be great too. But you did write a little bit about it, and I believe in your Fab 4 FAQ 2.0, because the project pretty much started in '74. I
Mm-hmm.
think is while they were in Nashville recording, and the idea of it being a hot hits, cold cuts, which would comprise of non-album singles, and then you get tracks that were left off previous albums, because by 1974 McCartney had this treasure trove of music that wasn't recorded, especially from sessions from Red Rose Speedway and Ram, just a lot of stuff, probably double his albums worth of stuff
Yeah, for
not
sure.
released, and especially the non-album singles as well. But then unfortunately, come 75, it looks like they're gonna get this released in March of '75, and it would be a low budget release. I mean, all they probably would have had to have done is just do some mixing or overdubbing of the stuff that wasn't released yet, and they would have had this great LP release, but McCartney being as hot as he was back in '75, Band on the Run is still going strong. This album is number one 3 different times.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they just didn't feel the need to release a something like this, to maybe overexpose Paul. I mean, this would have been, I think, a great release for that time with all this material, don't you think?
Oh, definitely, yeah. But you get the point where there's so many projects he started and then had to shelve because events were moving faster than he could. You can look at the summer of '71, the Thrillington album that didn't see the light of day till '77. During that down period where Linda was pregnant and Wings kind of were on hold at that moment. They had expected to do another tour, but she became pregnant, and so they put out Thrillington, they put out Holly Days and Seaside Woman. So they're recording so incredibly prolifically. And as you know, Red Rose Speedway was originally intended to be a double album, but they had this ton of outtakes from the Ram sessions, and they just are constantly, if they're in the studio, they're doing something the Beatles never did. The Beatles, when they went in the studio, they knew what songs were going to be on the album. They almost never recorded material that they didn't put out. I mean, we know from Anthology, there's the odd track from Beatles for Sale that was left over. A couple things in the White Album didn't make the cut. But otherwise, everything's got a purpose. Paul is just blowing through these the studio time he's got, creating way more material than he would have a need to release on an album.
Right. So I see it as here's an ex-Beatle, if you will, excuse me, who's used to getting whatever he does put out. I just seem odd that even during this hot period that he's in, that an record executive doesn't see the dollar signs in this release, because I really think that, and especially those non-album singles, I mean, the only way you were going to get them is if you bought them when they came out. I mean, they weren't really reissuing non-album singles at the time either. So I just think this would be a great moneymaker for any label, really.
Yeah, it's kind of odd, the sort of decision-making process that goes on there, because as you point out correctly, that when the concept for cold cuts comes along, it makes perfect sense as a budget release to have out there. I mean, he didn't do an album in '74. That's between Band on the Run and Venus and Mars. That would have been the perfect time to put that out there as something, But he's so hot recording. He does what he does in Nashville. I think it was like 7 finished tracks plus some jamming that was put on tape. So, and that's the same year that he does the McGear album. So he's just so unbelievably prolific in his recording habits. And then there was a period after Wings Over America that comes out, end of '76 or something. Triple record set, spawns a hit single. So he could have maybe put it out late in '77, but he rolls into London Town Sessions and the Girls' School Mullet Tire single. So maybe he just was like, you know what, I'll keep that on the back burner. But then you look at what happens in '78 when they put out Wings' Greatest. That was screaming for a double album treatment. Because the single that did come out didn't even have everything on it. Technically, it wasn't Pure Wings either. It had Uncle Albert on it. That's not a Wings song. But anyway, that could have been a double album that they could have put out some of these other A-sides and stuff that would have made sense, fleshing out as a nice, attractive package with the hits, the hot hits and the cold cuts. That would have been the moment to do it.
Robert, do you think the album would have been better suited as a late 70s release, or like it was supposed to come out again in 86, 87 with Around All the Best, when he was thinking about packaging Waterspout on there as a part of All the Best, but also it was rumored to come out again that time? Do you think it would have been better as a late 70s release or later in the 80s?
I tend to think that because a lot of that material we're discussing here was Wings recordings. If they'd done it in the 80s, it would be of a defunct band, unless he wanted to do some kind of Wings retrospective where he could have, cherry-picked the best of Wings output and then a second disc of all this great unreleased stuff. That would have been another approach that might have made sense as sort of this archival thing. But, there would have been like Waterspout, which was a solo recording. And maybe thematically to him it didn't make sense at that point. But it seems like, I don't know, I have to think about this, do the research, but there are artists that happened upon the idea of spinning off this sort of semi-bootleg or sanctioned bootleg material just to get it out to the public, put it out there at a lower list price, maybe make it a limited edition, mail order only, something like that. Eventually, we would see things like the Bob Dylan bootleg series, which is incredibly well curated, and Rhino Handmade, those wonderful Monkeys packages they put out. It seems like there would have been an outlet for that Paul could have pioneered, given this mountain of material he was sitting on top of. But he's a busy guy; he's too busy creating to look back at what he's created.
Right. So, like you say, I mean, this project reappears in 77, 78 while they're taking a break due to Linda's pregnancy. And again, it's this time around it's planned as a double album, as you say, the hot hits on one LP, and then the outtakes on the second LP. And we did, I think, kind of get this in a way with that Wingspan's release, where one disc you got all hits. And then the second disc, you got, the deeper tracks, but not really, we didn't really get anything, that was eventually became B-sides, like Mama's Little Girl, some,
Right.
Do We Meet Here Before,
we only got Hey
stuff
Diddle.
like that.
We only got Hey Diddle on Wingspan, I think.
Anyway. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like you said, this would have made perfect sense to release this in that 78 area, but for some reason Paul couldn't get a double album out to save his life at that time.
Right. Yoko could. But Yoko could.
What's that?
But Yoko could.
Two of them, as a matter of fact, right?
Yeah.
It's funny, during that era, the Love Songs compilation came out, and that didn't do too well commercially either, which is kind of a weird thing.
Right?
Yeah.
That was late 77, and it didn't do nearly as well as rock and roll music did.
Also a double album, yeah.
It had better packaging.
Yeah. So then the final days of the Wings, they started working on the project again in '81. They start working on a number of overdubs for a mid '81 release. But then this doesn't happen as well. We know the story. We end up getting Tug of War. Paul breaks the Wings up, and we've always heard the story of George Martin telling Paul that he just wanted to record a Paul McCartney record. He didn't want to record the next Wings record, and then I think that was the excuse Paul gave the members of Wings, like, hey, we're just going to release a Paul McCartney record. Have you researched that at all? You think that's accurate information, that Paul just pretty much used George Martin for an excuse for that reason?
Yeah, hide behind George Martin.
Yeah, exactly.
It's entirely possible. I mean, he is given that sort of when he's doing a self-analysis about the end of Wings, and people were taking him to task about the Japanese pot bust, which pretty much sealed their fate as a collective entity. That was there a subconscious motivation behind that you purposely allowed yourself to sabotage the Japanese tour that way? I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think there's probably an element of truth to that he was looking to wind it down for whatever reason. I'm not really sure what that would have been. But certainly he was looking to work on a full-blown George Martin project where George Martin says, I'm not interested in making a Wings project, but this is what we'll do. We'll cast each track, according to the talent that we need. And that would have been an idea to appeal to Paul to, have that kind of control. Because if we're at all honest with ourselves, that is the essence of Paul as a band leader, is having that control over everything and not be challenged too often. That's some people would say is to his detriment, is except when he works alongside an Elvis Costello or somebody like that, or George Martin that's going to tell him what's what. He doesn't tend to like that very much. But maybe he's thinking, John's dead now. Maybe I should start thinking about my place in the rock hierarchy, specifically because John's being put on this untouchable pedestal this time. So maybe I should swing for the fences with Tug of War. And George Martin's viewpoint sort of was an alignment, like, yeah, you need to make a great album now.
Right. So then now, fast forward 5 years, like Andy said, 86, he starts working on this project again. This time he has Roger Niles, and then he also has the help of Chris Thomas, who Talk More Talk was fortunate enough to interview at the White Album Symposium, and I believe you interviewed Chris Thomas as well. That's correct, Robert?
Yep.
Yeah, very lovely guy. I mean, found his information to be, really cool. Great talking with him, and he had. I had asked him if he had helped, if it was accurate that he did help about with this with the project in '86, and he talked about one of the things that he did like working on was, I believe it was Water Spout that was going to be for this project, right, Andy?
Yeah.
So he talked about working on that. And then again, what did we get as a finished project? We got another greatest hits.
At least we had a new song on it, though.
Strange how these decisions are made. It's just very strange that there's so many projects, again, that they take on, like One Hand Clapping, that ends up sitting on the shelf forever. They record that last Wings tour in '79, Glasgow. We get one track as a single, and then the rest of it, it just fades away. That would have been, most artists of the day put out at least a couple live albums during the course of their careers. And so something to follow up Wings Over America would not have been out of the question.
Right. So you're a little older than us. I'm sure you would admit. Not saying that you're older or anything, but nothing like that had been released in the past of like B-sides and outtakes and stuff like that during the 80s and 70s. Wouldn't that be correct or accurate?
It just depends on the level that the artist is operating at. Not at a Beatle level for sure. There's other people that, through contractual obligation or something, had to put something out. You look at the Elvis output in the 70s, a lot of that stuff is just collated from all over the place. The Kinks had the Great Lost Kinks album. So there were definitely people out there. Too. Pardon me?
We also had Men Love Avenue as well. But
in the 80s,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Neither fish nor fowl. It was just something, cleaning out the vaults. And then I always thought that was Yoko trying to get a handle on Walls and Bridges because she wasn't really part of that whole thing. Mm-hmm. And here she has some Walls and Bridges material that she could put her stamp on. I'm glad to have it, but by that time we'd already had bootlegs of that stuff.
Sure.
Something Precious and Rare being one of them.
Good one, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, eventually now, since we didn't get this project through any point in time in the 70s and 80s, I believe it was starting with Flowers in the Dirt that we started seeing some of these songs become B-sides.
Yes, for the CD singles.
Yeah, exactly, CD singles.
Mama's Little Girl being the first, or no? Or no?
I remember, what was it, what was the single that had My Carnival and Lunchbox, Odd Socks? Yeah. So
but we first got My Carnival, I believe, with Spies Like Us.
Yes. I knew it was something in the 80s, and it was on vinyl. Yeah. And that was sort of like, I think, a baby step toward wanting to get some material out there. CDs, when did they come out? Like in 1985 or something like that? Right. And once they realized they had so much audio space they could fill, that they then started to fill it, with this kind of stuff that was sitting on the shelf. And then come Concord and the McCartney reissue series, that's something that when it first started, I was very happy to have. I was very happy to have these nice box sets with books in them and different discs of different outtakes and stuff like that. And I would say along the way, again to, because everything defaults back to 8 arms to hold you. You became, you knew what there was to work with, and you're starting to question, well, maybe there's other stuff they could have fleshed this out with that we know exists. Why didn't they make that call? And then come, what was it, the fall of 2018, the Imagine box comes out. And that's not my favorite John Lennon album, if I'm being completely honest. But boy, was that beautifully put together. And I thought that set a real standard there that I would love to see other artists visiting their archives, adhere to that, and you can't go wrong.
Good value on that box set, too.
Who?
Good value on that Imagine box set as well.
Yes. Fantastic, yes. And it's, I was perfectly happy when the McCartney series started out, but then along the way, I started thinking, maybe the people working on these aren't the most informed. Maybe they should tap one of the people like ourselves that maybe know the material or what the fans want more than they might, because presentation counts for something, and adding that value, like you say, you could really, for something that costs you nothing, because it's already recorded and probably already mastered too, you could put this stuff out there and serve the public and give a greater context to these albums by showing what was recorded around it.
Right. Yeah, and sometimes it's a hit or miss, a hit or miss on these archive sets too, because, you'll get, sometimes you'll get 2 at a time. I remember you got Pipes of Peace and Tug of War at the same time. Tug of War was jam-packed on that second disc, while, the Pipes of Peace second disc was probably half the amount of time on that. The only real thing of coolness on that was probably It's Not On, which, I don't think anybody had heard, on the boot or anywhere,
No.
So, I mean, it is a little bit, it's great, like you said, but it is a little inconsistent as well, because, and the same thing with Venus and Mars and Wings at the Speed of Sound. Venus and Mars was packed on that second disc, and then Wings at the Speed of Sound was unfortunately lacking as well. So, some of these second discs are hit or miss, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally get you. And that's the thing that it becomes frustrating to McCartney fans, because you wonder, will they ever be revisited? Will there ever be some kind of corrective to this?
Right. And some of them were. I mean, with so tracks that, potentially could have been on these cold cuts throughout the years. We have A Love for You, which, as we know, I think we first saw it in the In-Laws soundtrack, which was which first place I saw it. But by then it was probably already on bootleg, wouldn't it? Have been on a cold cuts bootleg already?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. There was bootlegs of cold cuts that had come out, and so fans were aware of a lot of this stuff.
Right. So then you got, Best Friend, the live recording from Wings Over Europe. You got Blue Sway, which ended up being on the McCartney 2 archive set. And then you got, singles, non-album singles like See Moon and Good Night Tonight and Hi Hi Hi, which, appeared on the appropriate year's box set when those have been coming out as well. Things we haven't seen yet, like Robert's Ball and Cage, only because, we haven't gotten those box sets yet. So surprising that he's been holding back on those, something like Robert's Ball and Cage. And what was the other one? Water Sprout for so many years. I'm surprised that those never got a B-side release.
One of the interesting ones I've always felt that are in this kind of cold cuts collection is that Did We Meet Somewhere Before, which kind of had an official release because it was in the Ramones Rock and Roll High School film.
That's right.
But I don't think it was on the soundtrack, so it's in the film, but it's not. It's not on a soundtrack. So I know it's in that, and Robert, you can clarify if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, you know the story with that song, right? That was originally written for another film.
Right.
And Heaven Can Wait.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess the lead character was a clarinet player or something in the 1940s, and so it made total sense the way that song was produced and arranged.
Right.
And suddenly showing up in a Ramones film, it's like
so bizarre. So bizarre.
We need a Paul song. Any Paul song will do.
Right.
Yeah, and it was very, very. I was not expecting that at all when I had seen that movie as well. You get this couple second tidbit of a Paul McCartney song, and you're like, what the hell is it doing in this movie?
It makes zero sense. I just wonder what kind of backdoor deal was arranged to make this happen that cinematically makes zero sense at all. But you know what? It then suggests that maybe all the cinematic songs Paul has recorded could be a nice little compilation unto itself. Starting with Live and Let Die and all these things that were used in films, Spies Like Us. That would be a concept. You remember real music for the Beatles?
Sure,
This would be a
1982,
McCartney real music that actually holds together.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I mean, you're also looking at stuff like Twice in a Lifetime, which again I think only appeared in the movie. I don't think it was on the sound on the soundtrack. You had some of Linda's stuff like White Prairie, Seaside Woman, and Oriental Nightfish, which is my favorite thing that she's done.
Oh yeah.
I think it was recorded during the Band on the Run sessions, and I would have loved that song to be the first song on a Wings album with her on lead vocals. I think it would have been awesome on Band on the Run, just my opinion. And then you got Same Time Next Year, which is another song he did for a movie that didn't get that got turned down, which ended up being
perfectly fine track.
And it ended up being on Put It There for a B-side.
A 12-inch or Put It There single, I think. Yeah, right. So again, like we had Mama's Little Girl and Same Time Next Year pop up in that kind of 89-90 period for B-sides around Flowers in the Dirt, as you mentioned before, Tom. So
yeah.
It's totally random, though. It's like, he's got this mountain of material. Let's take two disparate songs that have nothing to do with each other and slap them together on this release.
And then fast forward to, 95, 96 when he's doing Ubu Jubu, and then we get even more stuff that we never heard before. Like Squid and I Love This House and stuff like that. And which, goes to what you were saying earlier. I mean, this guy has so much material that I think probably the only thing that would rival him is Prince, because we're getting all of this, Prince stuff now from his vault.
Then you got the Phil Ramone sessions, Lindiana.
All that.
I love that song.
Yeah. So much material. So, I hope that at some point maybe control of the archive series will shift in a different direction to where it's really put together in a way that makes sense, either by timeline, sessions, that sort of thing. It's like I think back to when they started reissuing Elvis Costello stuff, and originally came out on Ryko, the reissues of his first several albums. And I time I was perfectly satisfied with that. I thought, okay, cool. They're scooping up the stuff that I already had in bootleg, putting out in top quality, and then it got reissued by Rhino, and that was done even better. It's like, holy cow, they're taking what I thought was already pretty good, but they're it's possible to improve it. They're actually improving it. So maybe that'll happen with Paul at some point. It seems like of late there's been a bit of shifting, labels that stuff is coming out on. So maybe at some point, if he establishes his own label, not beholden to the whims of record companies that are going to say, well, we need to limit it to this. It's amazing in this day and age that somebody with the power in the business he has doesn't control his own destiny the same way.
Right.
You hear about the Harrison estate that they had to fight when Danny put together a much more comprehensive career-encompassing package that the record company balked at. And I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, didn't he have his own record label? I mean, how is this possible? Exactly. And it came out as Let It Roll, which really, was a fragment of what could have been.
Sure.
Right.
So
that's an interesting thing too, because it's their music technically. They're recording it on their own time in their own studios. I mean, the people like Capitol or Concord or even Warner Brothers with George Harrison. I mean, they're just distributing this stuff. How can they refuse not to do it?
I don't know, but it goes back to 1980 when you think about Somewhere in England being rejected by Warner Brothers. We don't hear a My Sweet Lord here. You're going to have to take this back and rework it. It's like, what the hell? Isn't that the point of setting up a record label?
Right.
It's just a pipeline.
It's really just for cosmetics, really. I mean, the big brother's still going to release the package. You want to put any kind of imprint on it, fine. We're still going to it's still going to be through us, which is basically what all those kind of boutique labels, Dark Horse, Apple, what have you, has become.
Rolling Stone,
right.
Swan Song,
all those, right.
Yeah, I did see that while looking up all the stuff on Cold Cuts, that he did also have an artist friend, Saul Steinberg, who did do a cover for the project as well. So it'd be interesting to see what that looked like.
Yeah.
I don't know if that had ever been officially released or not in one of the archive boxes. So
Well, it was nice. I mean, it was nice, Tom. You had shared it with me a couple days ago, and kind of contextualizing it now is that article that from his website from August of 2019, where he actually was asked about the project and talked about it.
Right.
So it seems like he wants to do it if for no other reason than to use that artwork.
Right. But he did say in the article, well, how do you juggle all these releases? I've got my own stuff, I've got the Beatles stuff, I've got the archival stuff, and then how do I fit it all in? Is basically what he said.
Yeah. Well, you delegate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but then like we said, I mean, the perfect times for this release would have been like a 77, 78 where there was a break in the action.
So. 81. He put out nothing that year. Sort of a nice post-Wings summary collection would have been great.
It would have been a nice postscript for the Wings period, knowing that they had kind of ended. Okay, here.
Yeah.
Here's a low-key release, kind of. As we kind of as he transitions into 80s kind of superstar doing all these kind of crazy duets with people, and here's just that he kind of just caps off the Wings period with a release like that. 80, 81 would have been a perfect time for that.
Well, yeah, because 81, I think that ends his streak of releasing any product, starting with in 62 with the Beatles, I believe is accurate to say.
Yeah, I think you're right, actually. And it would have been nice to end Wings because they were on it. They did the overdubs and some of the older material, so it would have been a farewell release from that last iteration.
Right. Yeah, that would have been a great time as well, 81. So, but yeah, I mean, cool. I'm glad that we, chatted about this. And, there is one question I like to ask my guests who are in the know or they really appreciate the solo stuff. Specifically, the first 5 years, and this is going to include John and Paul. We all know how closely they work together, during their times in the in the Beatles, and we all know that they get some crap for the releases, throughout their career. But my question to you, Robert, is whose career do you think missed whose more? I mean, did Paul's career miss John more, or did John's career miss Paul's more?
That's a really good question. And maybe my default answer to that is if you want to hold the Beatles as the high standard that they've got to live up to, and having the best quality control in the world with George Martin at the helm, and just their own innate sort of friendly competition where they're writing for each other. Anything they bring to the Beatles has to pass muster with the other, and they're each other's editors of their work as well. So I think historically it was John who needed the other Beatles the most. He got more out of being a Beatle than maybe the rest of them did, because Paul certainly would, anytime he wrote something, have it fully blueprinted in his head and was not shy about, okay, this is what I want you to do on drums, and George, play here or don't play here. He had that sort of vision of what he was conceiving, where John would describe things in abstract. I need to hear 10,000 monks chanting on a hill. You'll fix it, George Martin. And so I think he benefited the most. It's like to revert to a description in a guest that I had on the show last year, a guy named Tom Brothers, who wrote this book on the magic of collaboration. He said that when you look at a finished recording, and in the Beatles' case, there's a lot of people who look at A Day in the Life and think, oh, that's a great John Lennon composition. Well, maybe it's a great John Lennon composition, but it's akin to, in cinematic terms, the guy who wrote the script being, step one. But then the actors bring something to life when they take it up. The director, the producer, the cinematographer, everybody around that's involved in a step toward the finished product, they all contribute to it. And, if John had brought in Strawberry Fields the way he did, this acoustic ballad, and had zero input from George Martin and the other Beatles, maybe that would have been the form it came out of. What if he wrote that in 1970 and put it out? You wouldn't have this magnificent, wonderful, groundbreaking recording, but that's the magic of collaboration. You want to go back to Tomorrow Never Knows. Again, his composition. George brings in the exotic tambura. Ringo's got that wonderful drum pattern. It sounds like an electronica loop. And then Paul brings in the takes. All of that contributing to the whole. So to get back to your question, who benefited or who needed maybe the others the most, John, especially once he got rid of Spector and started producing himself, I think there was a bit of a learning curve there. If he witnessed the difference between Mind Games and Walls and Bridges, I think by Walls and Bridges he hit his stride as a producer, having experience along the way with Harry Nilsson and the one-off he did with Jagger, and just various things along the way where he'd been in the studio alongside Richard Perry and such. He was learning a lot. Whereas Mind Games, I think, suffers from sounding rushed, and you didn't really get to hear all that he recorded in the form that he released it. Not until he did the remix in, I think, 2006, when suddenly, wow, this is a much better album than I thought it was.
Remix is tremendous, yeah.
Yeah, whereas Paul, I don't think you ever listen to Wing stuff and think, man, if you'd only remix this better or arrange this differently, whether you accept the quality of his work as an artist or not, I don't think, other than the fact that John Lennon was the guy that could tell him, no, you need to flesh this out. She was just 17, no teenage beauty queen, wherever the line is that he changes to, you know what I mean. Instantly elevates that song to something completely different. Or I could buy you diamond rings, for drive my car. John was the guy that said, no, Paul, that's bullshit. You come up with something like that. And maybe you could look at Wings, first album release and go, okay, John Lennon would have seen through this and like, you know what, you can edit this or you can step up your game with this. So but that's the beauty of the Beatles' magic, is what they gave to each other.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, we know you're an extremely busy guy. I want to give you a chance to, plug whatever you've got going. Whatever appearances you've got coming up. I know you just did an appearance for the Museum of Broadcast Communications yesterday. How was that? What else you got coming up or in the works that you want to talk about?
Well, that was a great one. That was it was me and Wally and Kid O'Toole together, and it just came together. And I loved the fact that we knew that we were ostensibly there to talk about the weekend anniversary of the Ed Sullivan appearance, but it wasn't like we scripted anything in advance. We just basically went with the moment. And that's what I think kind of leads to the magic, where you never know what you can't anticipate what you're going to get asked. But really it was about the Beatles and the relationship with television. So we got a lot of nice conversation out of that. So I like situations like that. And, there was a certain comfort level, because I've known Kit for years. I've known Wally for years. Wally being the guy that, in his own way, sort of set me on my path by writing All Together now with Harry Castleman. So that was always kind of cool, too. So that was that. As far as the podcast goes, I've got half a dozen shows in the can right now. Some great guests coming up, including Jenny Boyd, Robert Rosen. Who else? Dan Rifkin, who does the that blog on the Beatles Let It Be sessions. They May Be Parted. Great blog. Upcoming shows with Doug Saltby and Chip Mattinger, and I just did Spencer Lee, as I mentioned earlier. And then beyond that, there will be an announcement made this week on my Something About the Beatles page and Twitter account about something big happening in May. I cannot say any more at this point, but know that it's coming. And it will be exciting. It will be something that I would say all fans will be very interested in. And think, if you want a sort of a clue, here's a clue for you all. Start thinking about 50th anniversaries this year.
Okay.
And ways to celebrate them and commemorate them.
And you're saying when would this be released?
I think the ducks will be in a row by this week sometime, by the end of the week for sure.
Okay, for an announcement.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Wow. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm going to tip my hand a little bit here and there, but I not at liberty to say everything just yet. So, final T's have been crossed.
Right. Well, I do know that you had mentioned something, so maybe we'll talk about it off the air when we're done recording, because I know you did mention that you were writing something a few years ago, so I don't know if that is the project or whatnot, but this is great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining us for this.
Anytime.
I do want to talk about this giveaway real quick. At the beginning of the show, I mentioned 3 books that we could send to you if you want them. Once again, they're The True Story of the Beatles, John Lennon's in His Own Right, and Spaniard in the Works, and also The Longest Cocktail Party, which we talked briefly about earlier in the show. All you have to do is email me at twolegspodcast@gmail.com and just write down one of Robert's books. It could be anything. It could be the Fab Four FAQ, 2.0, Solo in the '70s, the Revolver book, the first Fab Four FAQ, and your address, and be the first person. Be the first person to do that, and I'll send them off to you. So once again, Robert, how can anybody get a hold of you if they want to do that?
I'm on Facebook under a couple different titles. One is Fab 4 FAQ 2.0 page, which is a daily on this day in Beatle history, or actually rock history through 1980.
Right.
And then there's the Something About the Beatles page on Facebook, Twitter at satby/show. So those are my main channels right now. I'm told I have an Instagram account, but I haven't really done anything with it. So hopefully this will be the year for that.
Very good. Andy, anything you got coming up?
Not much. I'll just keep on, plugging along and getting well, and plugging along with our Two Legs podcast and our YouTube page and all that kind of stuff like that, which you can find all of our previous shows on there, which Tom can plug at the end. But yeah, that'll be my kind of things that I kind of keep up with to keep Two Legs plugging along. Please follow us on all of our pages, which Tom, you know them all by heart. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, and we will be at the Fest for Beatle fans at the end of March. Robert, are you going to attend the Fest this year in Jersey?
I will be there because that will be the launch of the book, The Beatles in Context, which I wrote a chapter for.
Awesome.
Oh, very cool. So you participated in that as well with Kid O'Toole and
sure
many
did.
other authors. Cool. Very cool. Well, I look forward to seeing you there. That's great. So like Andy said, we're everywhere. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Two Legs Podcast. You can email us at twolegspodcast@gmail.com. Facebook, we had to do a new Facebook page. As you know, actually, I found out, Andy, that several Paul McCartney pages got unpublished. For one reason or the other. I think it was, impersonation, I think, was the reasoning. So we did a new Facebook page, which is just Two Legs Podcast. That took the Paul McCartney.
Maybe that's why we had his name in there. Maybe that's what the red flag was.
Possibly. So we took care of that. We're back now on Facebook at Two Legs Podcast. Our YouTube channel is up, Two Legs Podcast as well. That's where you'll see the video versions of this show. So head over there and check that out as well. And I think that might be it. So as always, I want to thank Andy once again. I want to thank Robert Rodriguez for being here. I'm Tom Hunyadi, and as always, everybody have a great day and a beautiful night.
Listening to Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, hosted by Tom Hunyadi and Andy Nichols, with musical contributions by Dylan